Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel NPA Discovery, where we uncover the untold stories behind Hollywood's brightest stars and darkest scandals. If you love discovering the hidden truths of the icons who shaped entertainment history, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with friends who enjoy these kinds of deep dives. Every bit of support motivates us to keep bringing you powerful stories that don't just entertain, but inspire. Well, today, we're going to explore that question together. And trust me, you'll want to stay with us until the end, because the emotional impact of his story is one you won't forget. Jack Carlton Moore, later known as Clayton Moore, was born in Chicago in September 1914, the youngest of three boys. Now, when we think of someone destined to become America's cowboy hero, we might picture a childhood spent wrangling horses or roaming open plains. But Clayton's early years were surprisingly urban. His father, Charles Moore, wasn't a cowboy or a sheriff. He was a real estate broker from New York. This meant that little Jack, before he ever donned a mask, grew up in comfort, not hardship. In fact, the Moore family's lifestyle was prosperous enough that they employed a live-in maid. This fact alone may surprise you. While he would later embody rugged independence on television, his beginnings were cushioned by stability and privilege. But privilege doesn't mean lack of ambition. Even as a child, Jack was restless, adventurous, and daring. By the age of 8, he was already displaying the fearless athleticism that would later define his career. While most boys were climbing trees or playing stickball in Chicago's neighborhoods, Jack was flying through the air, literally. He had joined the circus. That's right. Clayton Moore's first taste of the spotlight came as a pint-sized acrobat. And when you pause to think about it, that decision tells us a lot about him. Becoming an acrobat required courage, trust, and an instinct for showmanship. These were qualities that would serve him later, not just as an actor, but as someone who constantly had to fight for his place in Hollywood. His trapeze act wasn't some small-time carnival stunt either. Moore performed before audiences who were captivated by his talent. Imagine it, a young boy, soaring across the tent on a trapeze, defying gravity, and commanding attention with the poise of a seasoned performer. This was more than childlike adventure, it was early evidence that Moore had something special, a combination of physical skill and stage presence. And soon, those qualities opened new doors. His athletic build and striking looks, square jaw, strong features, classic, all-American, handsomeness, caught the eye of talent scouts. Before long, he landed modeling gigs with none other than John Robert Powers, a top modeling agency at the time. Here's where we can pause for a bit of reflection. Many people think of Hollywood stars as overnight successes. But for Moore, like many actors, success was a ladder. First the circus, then modeling, then acting. At every stage, he had to reinvent himself, to take the opportunities that came his way and expand them into something bigger. By the late 1930s, Moore had set his sights on Hollywood. He wasn't content to just be a model, posing for photos wasn't enough. He wanted to tell stories. And he had the looks, the athleticism, and the ambition to give it a real shot. When he arrived in Hollywood, however, he faced a problem that many newcomers faced, his name. Jack Carlton didn't exactly have the kind of ring that echoed across movie posters. It was producer Edward Small who encouraged him to adopt a name with more punch. And so, Jack Carlton became Clayton Moore. It may sound superficial, but in Hollywood, a name is everything. Think about it, would Jack Carlton have been as memorable as Clayton Moore? Probably not. This was one of those small but pivotal changes that set him on the path toward stardom. At first, Moore found steady work not as a leading man, but as a stuntman. And this makes perfect sense. He had been flipping through circus tents since he was a child. He had no fear of heights, speed, or physical risk. Hollywood needed people who could do the dangerous work that big stars couldn't, or wouldn't, do. This is where we can stop and appreciate something about Moore. Many actors dream of fame, but not all of them are willing to break their bones, literally, for it. Clayton Moore was. He wasn't afraid of the hard, dangerous, unglamorous work that came before the spotlight. And gradually, he started landing speaking roles too. They weren't glamorous. He appeared in B-movies, westerns, and low-budget cliffhangers. But these roles gave him experience, discipline, and connections. His career, like a horse at the start of a long ride, was beginning to move from a trot to a gallop. Meanwhile, his personal life was also on the move. In August 1940, Moore married Mary M. Francis in Las Vegas. The details of their marriage are murky, but what is clear is that it didn't last. Just 2 years later, they divorced. For many stars, divorce could have been devastating, fuel for scandal columns. But Moore didn't let it slow him down. In 1943, he remarried, this time to Sally Allen in Arizona. Together, they adopted a daughter named Dawn, who would play an important role in his life later on. But just as his personal life seemed to stabilize, history intervened. World War II broke out, and like millions of other young men, Moore answered the call. But here's the twist, he didn't serve as a soldier on the front lines. Instead, he joined the U.S. Army Air Forces, as an actor. Yes, you heard that right. While others flew planes and carried rifles, Moore starred in training films like Target Invisible, working alongside actors like Arthur Kennedy. His job wasn't to fight but to educate and inspire, keeping morale high for servicemen. Some might scoff at this, but let's think about it. The war effort wasn't just about guns and bombs, it was about information, communication, and spirit. By making training films, Moore was contributing in a way that fit his skills. It also foreshadowed what would later define his career, the ability to inspire audiences through a screen. For nearly a decade, Clayton Moore lived as the Lone Ranger not just on screen, but in the public imagination. However, Hollywood is a fickle place. When the series ended in 1957, Moore faced the challenge every actor dreads, typecasting. Producers saw him only as the masked cowboy. Offers for other roles dwindled, and Moore quickly realized he had been both blessed and cursed by his success. His identity was so fused with the Lone Ranger that audiences struggled to accept him in any other role. And yet, Moore didn't wallow in bitterness. He made a choice that defined his legacy. Instead of running from the mask, he embraced it. He continued making public appearances as the Lone Ranger, donning the black mask, white hat, and silver bullets, greeting children across the country. This is where we see the measure of the man. Many actors resent being typecast, but Clayton Moore understood something deeper. The Lone Ranger represented hope, fairness, and morality to millions. Why would he abandon that when he could keep those values alive? Still, the 1960s and 70s were not easy. Hollywood was shifting away from wholesome family heroes toward darker, more flawed characters. In that cultural change, Moore risked becoming a relic. But rather than fade away, he leaned into his role as a living symbol. The lawsuit and the mask taken away. Then came the most painful chapter in his life. In 1979, a new Lone Ranger movie was in development. The studio behind it, fearing confusion between their film and Moore's appearances, filed a lawsuit. They barred him from wearing the mask in public. Imagine that for a moment. The man who embodied the Lone Ranger more than anyone else, who spent decades inspiring children, was told he could no longer wear the very mask that defined him. For Moore, it was like being stripped of his identity. The court battle dragged on. Moore was heartbroken, but he refused to give up. He kept making appearances, this time wearing wraparound sunglasses in place of the mask. Crowds still lined up. Children didn't care whether it was a mask or glasses, they just wanted to see their hero. And here's the inspiring part, instead of turning bitter, Moore handled the ordeal with dignity. He could have lashed out at the studio, but he remained calm, poised, and respectful. That grace only made people love him more. The public rallied to his side, and the lawsuit backfired on the studio. In fact, the 1981 movie bombed at the box office, while Clayton Moore's reputation soared. By the mid-1980s, the studio dropped the restrictions, and Moore proudly returned to wearing the mask. Justice, in a way, had been served. The man behind the mask. It's easy to think of Clayton Moore only as a cowboy hero, but behind the mask was a man of remarkable integrity. He wasn't playing a role for the cameras, he lived those values every day. He refused to sign autographs for money, believing heroes shouldn't profit from their fans. He spent countless hours visiting hospitals, talking with sick children, offering encouragement and comfort. He reminded them to do good for others, echoing the Rangers' famous creed. There's a story told by one fan: as a boy, he met Moore at a county fair. Nervous and shy, the boy fumbled his words. Instead of brushing him off, Moore knelt down, looked him in the eye, and spoke gently until the boy relaxed. That boy, now grown, said he never forgot the kindness. It shaped the kind of man he wanted to be. This was the essence of Clayton Moore. He wasn't wealthy by Hollywood standards. He wasn't chasing fame or fortune. He cared more about the impact he had on people's lives. In many ways, he was the Lone Ranger without the mask. Recognition and honors. In 1990, Moore's contributions were formally recognized when he was awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. For him, it was not just a personal honor, but a validation that the Lone Ranger, and what he stood for, would always have a place in American history. But perhaps even more meaningful than Hollywood accolades were the countless letters Moore received from fans. Parents wrote to thank him for shaping their childhood. Veterans wrote to say they carried his creed of service and integrity into their adult lives. Children, still discovering old reruns of the Lone Ranger, wrote simply to tell him he was their hero. Moore never brushed these messages aside. He read them, often replying when he could. Unlike some stars who saw fan mail as a burden, he saw it as a sacred duty. Each letter was proof that his work mattered, that his life had meaning far beyond ratings and ticket sales. This, in truth, was his greatest award, not a star in the sidewalk, but the admiration of millions whose lives he touched. Final farewell and legacy. Clayton Moore passed away in 1999 at the age of 85. The news spread quickly across America, and for many, it felt like losing a member of the family. Obituaries didn't just talk about an actor, they spoke about a man who embodied an ideal. At his funeral, fans and friends gathered to remember the man behind the mask. Many wept openly, not just because of his death, but because of what he represented. He wasn't just a performer, he was a moral compass in a world that often seemed to lose its way. And here is the lesson we can all take: Moore's legacy proves that greatness is not measured in wealth or fame, but in the lives you touch. He didn't just play a hero. He was one, quietly, consistently, without fanfare. Today, whenever someone watches an old episode of The Lone Ranger, they don't just see a man in a mask. They see a symbol of justice, kindness, and resilience. They see Clayton Moore. And perhaps the most powerful truth is this: the Lone Ranger never really rode off into the sunset. He lives on in the spirit of every child who grew up believing in doing what's right, no matter the cost. The mask as a symbol. When we look back at Clayton Moore's life, it's impossible to separate him from the mask. For many actors, a prop is just a costume piece, something you put on for the camera, then toss aside when the director yells, "Cut." But for Moore, the mask wasn't just leather and fabric. It was a symbol. It represented courage, integrity, and justice, values he believed America needed desperately, especially during times of turbulence. The mask reminded people that no matter how dark the world may seem, there will always be someone willing to stand up for what's right. Even after he was forced by a lawsuit to remove it, Moore showed us something profound: you don't need a mask to live like a hero. The strength of character comes not from what you wear, but from how you live. His sunglasses during that period became just as iconic because they carried the same spirit. Think about that for a moment. When the world tried to strip him of his symbol, he created a new one, proving that true identity can never be taken away. The creed of the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger had a creed, a list of moral principles that children memorized like scripture. Clayton Moore lived by those words. They weren't just lines from a TV show, they were a guide for life. One line read, "To have a friend, a man must be one." Another, "All things change but truth, and truth alone lives on forever. Moore carried those ideals with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. He treated fans with respect, he gave his time generously, and he never sought to tarnish the image of the Lone Ranger for a quick profit. In today's world, where scandals and selfishness so often dominate headlines, Moore's steadfastness feels refreshing, almost revolutionary. He showed us that you can live a life of consistency, holding on to your values even when no one is watching. When he said, "Hi-yo Silver, away," it wasn't just a catchphrase. It was a call to action, a reminder to ride toward justice, not away from it. Why his story still matters. So why should Clayton Moore's story matter to us today, decades after his passing? Because in a culture often obsessed with fame and fortune, he reminds us of something deeper: legacy. Fame fades. Money comes and goes. But the way you treat others, that lasts. Moore left behind no scandals, no bitterness, no regrets. He left behind admiration, respect, and a legend that continues to inspire. And maybe that's the greatest measure of success, not how high you climb, but how many people you lift along the way. When children saw Clayton Moore walk into a room, they didn't just see a TV star, they saw hope. When adults saw him, they were reminded of a time when heroes stood tall, not because of their guns, but because of their goodness. Clayton Moore reminds us that we don't need to be in a Hollywood spotlight to make a difference. We just need the courage to live by our principles, to help others, and to choose kindness when the world offers us cynicism. That is why the Lone Ranger, and the man behind the mask, still rides with us today. The man who became the legend. Clayton Moore never set out to be a cultural icon. He was a stuntman, a working actor, just another face trying to survive in Hollywood. But when destiny placed the Lone Ranger's mask in his hands, he understood something many actors miss: this wasn't just a role, it was a responsibility. And what separates Moore from so many others is that he carried that responsibility with humility. He never called himself a hero. He never claimed to be larger than life. Instead, he let his actions, both on and off the screen, speak for him. When people talk about the Lone Ranger, they aren't just talking about a fictional cowboy, they're talking about Clayton Moore himself. He blurred the line between character and man until they became one. And in doing so, he created a legend that outlived him. A legacy beyond Hollywood. Today, you'll find countless actors who've worn masks, superheroes, vigilantes, icons of the big screen. But how many of them lived the values of their characters once the cameras stopped? Very few. That's what makes Clayton Moore so rare. Moore carried those ideals with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. He treated fans with respect, he gave his time generously, and he never sought to tarnish the image of the Lone Ranger for a quick profit. In today's world, where scandals and selfishness so often dominate headlines, Moore's steadfastness feels refreshing, almost revolutionary. He showed us that you can live a life of consistency, holding on to your values even when no one is watching. When he said, "Hi-yo Silver, away," it wasn't just a catchphrase. It was a call to action, a reminder to ride toward justice, not away from it. Why his story still matters. So why should Clayton Moore's story matter to us today, decades after his passing? Because in a culture often obsessed with fame and fortune, he reminds us of something deeper: legacy. Fame fades. Money comes and goes. But the way you treat others, that lasts. Moore left behind no scandals, no bitterness, no regrets. He left behind admiration, respect, and a legend that continues to inspire. And maybe that's the greatest measure of success, not how high you climb, but how many people you lift along the way. When children saw Clayton Moore walk into a room, they didn't just see a TV star, they saw hope. When adults saw him, they were reminded of a time when heroes stood tall, not because of their guns, but because of their goodness. Clayton Moore reminds us that we don't need to be in a Hollywood spotlight to make a difference. We just need the courage to live by our principles, to help others, and to choose kindness when the world offers us cynicism. That is why the Lone Ranger, and the man behind the mask, still rides with us today. The man who became the legend. Clayton Moore never set out to be a cultural icon. He was a stuntman, a working actor, just another face trying to survive in Hollywood. But when destiny placed the Lone Ranger's mask in his hands, he understood something many actors miss. This wasn't just a role, it was a responsibility. And what separates Moore from so many others is that he carried that responsibility with humility. He never called himself a hero. He never claimed to be larger than life. Instead, he let his actions, both on and off the screen, speak for him. When people talk about the Lone Ranger, they aren't just talking about a fictional cowboy, they're talking about Clayton Moore himself. He blurred the line between character and man until they became one. And in doing so, he created a legend that outlived him. A legacy beyond Hollywood. Today, you'll find countless actors who've worn masks, superheroes, vigilantes, icons of the big screen. But how many of them lived the values of their characters once the cameras stopped? Very few. That's what makes Clayton Moore so rare.